All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Accessibility in the Mobile Age. I'm Natalie DeHart with IAAP. Before we get started, I want to quickly review a few things. Everyone should either be logged into Adobe Connect, or you can follow along with the presentation handout provided and listen over the phone. During today's webinar, if you would like to ask questions, our speaker does plan to stop for questions throughout. If you have a question, you can simply type it into the chat area and we will get those answered for you. And to guard against background noise, I've put everyone on mute. If you are hearing audio both over your computer speakers and over the phone, you can hang up the phone and listen through the computer only, or you can turn off your computer speakers and listen through the phone. I would also like to remind everyone that we are recording this webinar. Thank you again for joining us today for Accessibility in the Mobile Age. Our speaker today is Tim Springer, founder and CEO of SSB BARC Group. For nearly 2 decades, SSB has designed and implemented technology accessibility solutions for corporations, government agencies, and leading educational institutions. Tim led the development of InFocus, the industry's first commercial software for testing web accessibility. He served as the chief architect of SSB's accessibility management platform, which delivers the infrastructure to manage compliance across the enterprise development lifecycle. Tim advises many large public and private sector organizations on best practices required to successfully achieve accessibility. His clients include the Social Security Administration, Hewlett-Packard, and Wells Fargo Bank. We are delighted to have Tim with us this morning. I will now turn it over to him to start things off. Tim, are you there? We just had you a minute ago. I would try pressing star 6. See if that does anything, or pound 6. Try pound 6. There you are. Tim, are you there? Yes. Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
That was exciting. I had the unmuted message, but not the muted message. But what would a webinar be without a little telecommunications difficulty? It just wouldn't be the same.
Very true.
So thanks, Natalie. So today we're going to talk about accessibility in the mobile age. This is a relatively broad topic, and so we're going to bounce around a lot. It is intended to bounce around a lot and give you like a grab bag of a variety of different things that we have just seen in the market with accessibility, particularly as it applies to mobile platforms. Some of this will be applicable outside of that as well. But our focus is really on mobile platforms, and there is just a ton of really exciting, cool stuff happening on mobile platforms from an accessibility perspective, and so excited to have a chance to chat with you about it today. As Natalie mentioned, I will stop for questions. I'll also just keep the chat window open. So if you actually just go into the chat window, you can type questions in there. If I see them and they make sense to talk about in the flow of the webinar, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll have a big chunk of time at the end where we can talk about questions. We had also posted some notes up to the connection section of the IAAP site and have a couple of notes on that. We'll try to loop in as we go. And if we don't talk about them throughout the process here, we'll also just talk about them at the end. And I'll also probably post some responses up in connections as well, so we have it that way. With that said, the agenda is pretty straightforward. So first, talk at a real high level about the market and about some of the impacts of mobile as a market mover, but then really digging into the mobile accessibility aspects of it and where we see the trends going over the next 5 and 10 years and how we see that as impacting our approaches to accessibility with larger enterprise class customers. From there, jump into agile accessibility and really how do we implement and what do we see best practices as implementing accessibility in an agile development lifecycle. Not all mobile apps have to be developed in an agile process. God forbid you can use waterfall, but the vast majority of customers these days are using agile processes, and mobile being newer apps, it tends to be the dominant development methodology we see for mobile apps. Talk a little bit about remediation options. A lot of organizations will find themselves with mobile apps that they need to go in and then retrofit. So we'll give you some solutions for that, give you some different strategies for that, and then wrap up really with some testing approaches. How do we see testing work in the marketplace, and what are benefits and detriments of the various different testing approaches that are out there? Final note, you'll see throughout the presentation a variety of different pictures that I have on the slides. The pictures, unless I note them, are purely used for decorative purposes. There's no actual information in them. We just like to keep it from having to look at slides that have a bunch of bullet points and don't have pretty pictures. I will provide some commentary on them if I have what I think is good alt text. The alt text for this picture of the Singer sewing machine was proposed by someone in my organization as to sew or not to sew. That is the question. So I thought that was a pretty good one. But otherwise, the images are really just for fun. With that said, let's just get things started off and actually jump into the mobile market and how the mobile market's working and where it's progressing. There's a lot of data out there on mobile use, and you kind of know that it's a big market, but when you dig into it, it turns out that it really is a profoundly large market, and its use has really just exploded over the last 14, 15 years. So if you look at 1995 and compare it to 2014, which is the last point at which we pulled some data for it, and just so you know, too, the data and pretty pictures we have here are from a talk given by a lady named Mary Meeker, who's a partner at Kleiner Perkins Caulfield Byers, which is a leading venture capital firm. And she gives this wonderful, wonderful talk every year called her Internet Trends Talk. And it just gives you a lot of really compelling data about where the Internet as a whole is going and the use of it. And one of the big points she had in her 2015 talk was about mobile use. And so if you look at mobile use in 1995, about 80 million people had mobile phones. If you then fast forward to 2014, about 5.2 billion people had mobile phones. And to give you the real numbers there, that went from 1% of the global population in 1995 to about 73% of the global population in 2014. And of that 73%, the vast majority are still using feature phones, the majority are using feature phones. But you can see like about 40% of the population is actually using smartphones, and the growth of smartphones has been significant. So about 2.1 billion smartphone users that are out there. Also, what we see is that from a demographics perspective, millennials are adopting smartphones as the absolutely dominant platform, which isn't surprising to anyone. But about 87% of millennials will recognize or sort of characterize themselves as people that will have a smartphone that never leaves their side. And so it's not just that mobile use is happening, it's that we have these really powerful supercomputers that people are walking around with, and those supercomputers never ever leave their sides. And those supercomputers are used throughout the day to really access lots and lots of data. In addition, what we also see is that it's not just voice traffic and communication traffic. Really, the huge growth areas are in data and video traffic. And these are growing by 60, 80, 70% in 2014, 2013, and 2012 respectively for data. 55, 52, and 50% of mobile traffic was used for video in those years as well. So lots of data going to these devices, and also video becoming a really, really critical part of it. And then also just as a slice of the amount of time that we spend, we are now at the point where mobile devices account for more of our time with digital media than desktop devices do. And so we spend about 2.5 hours a day working with digital media on our mobile devices. That can be video, that can be music, that can be text, whatever it is. And we're actually down to about 2.4 hours a day on desktop devices. Television still beats that out just a little bit, but if you look at the demographic trends, even television is actually starting to move pretty dominantly towards mobile devices. With that said, so what does that really mean for people with disabilities? The reality is right now we still see the desktop as the primary means of access for people with disabilities. But mobile use is really reaching parity, and we see that continuing to move. So if you look at the screen reader survey that's done by WebAIM roughly annually, about 70% of users in the screen reader survey are saying, hey, look, we use mobile platforms. And we see that mobile platform reach and the growth of that mobile platform profoundly larger than sort of the more classic desktop applications. In addition, we see this idea that of the platforms, the distribution is really uneven. So iOS is far and away the dominant platform for accessible use. Android is about 21% and growing. Whereas if you look at the actual real world use and distribution of applicating systems, Android has probably about 85% of the market share at a slide I looked at yesterday in The Economist. And iOS has a very thin slice on top of that. So what we see there, kind of our perspective, is that there's still a lot of user choice going into that, and that the iOS platform tends to just have more use in the population of people with disabilities, but Android's growing and has a pretty strong approach. So kind of summatively, what we think is, hey, look, it's not quite at a level where there's a mobile-only option, but mobile augmentation option for people with disabilities is a very, very valid option at this point. The platforms themselves have a lot of support built in. That support has been validated and is widely used in the market, and we don't see any of those trends changing anytime soon. We think the underlying platforms continue to support use in an accessible fashion, and then that grows and evolves in a very compelling way going forward. With that said, the other thing we see really driving this is, in fact, communication. And at this point, mobile is definitely the dominant platform for communication that we see out there. Probably every single person that's on this webinar has a cell phone. I would hazard to guess that most people are making significantly more calls through their cell phone than they make through their desktop phones. At best, it's probably a parity. I would also hazard to guess that the amount of texting that's done via cellular applications or via your smartphone application is greater than some of the texting that you may do with other folks through desktop applications as well. In addition, we see messaging apps like WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Snapchat, WeChat, all of those different apps driving a lot of adoption. If you look at why people are also moving onto mobile platforms, a lot of the reasons that they cite for getting onto a mobile platform, for upgrading into a smartphone, is in fact communication applications and the desire to use those communication applications. And so we continue to see that driving things forward for pretty much the duration. Again, data use is growing, video use is growing, but we still see the reason for people getting on the platforms as a whole being communication. What's interesting is also that communication use, particularly in the United States, is governed by some very specific FCC requirements. Those requirements are promulgated under the 21st Century Communication and Video Accessibility Act, and those requirements have really strong restrictions on ensuring, I would say this, that the underlying communication platforms are accessible. That includes the smartphone, that includes smartphone operating systems, that includes then the actual services that are providing accessible solutions. And so what we ultimately see that as doing is ensuring that the base of accessibility on mobile devices is going to be much stronger on a long term, because it's on a very solid regulatory footing based on its use as a communication component. And we see that really having driven things in the market over the last couple of years and not stopping anytime soon. We also have this idea here at SSB, and I would challenge everybody that's on the webinar to think about this, which is, are mobile solutions really fundamentally more accessible than desktop solutions? At a base level, if we look at the mobile platform, we think there's a pretty good argument to be made that mobile platforms fundamentally are probably going to have better support for accessibility in the medium and long term than desktop platforms. And the reason for that is pretty straightforward. One is that both accessibility and assistive technology are now baked into pretty much all of the mobile operating system releases. Both iOS and Android have a lot of accessibility built in at this point, high levels of accessibility out of the box. iOS has a little greater control or has much greater control over operating system versioning, but Android has kind of increased that and is not as splintered. They also have very, very good assistive technologies that are then built in to the application. So while we see some slight leads here with iOS, really fundamentally the operating system providers are very aware of accessibility. They're building it into the underlying operating system at a basic level, and they're also supporting that build-in with the underlying operating system with actual bundled assistive technologies, which are actually quite good at this point, and do make some things accessible on a mobile platform that a lot of people would have argued prior to the presence of those assistive technologies would have been impossible or difficult to do. So that's one thing. We see the platforms as really fundamentally supporting this in a way that's more compelling. And as I mentioned before, we see that being driven by a really strong regulatory environment that's simply not present on the desktop. The other thing, which is kind of intuitive to most folks, is that mobile apps and sites tend to have simpler user interfaces. There's less stuff going on in the user interface. There's a need from a general usability perspective, not just an accessibility perspective, to keep it simple, to not put a lot of stuff on the screen, to keep things streamlined. And so we see that also as strongly supporting accessible use. That just by having simpler screens without a ton of screen real estate available to you, you're forced to make better design decisions for everyone. And those better design decisions for everyone then translate from a universal design perspective into better design solutions for people with disabilities. And in addition, while the app developer understanding is still pretty low with accessibility, we don't necessarily see that as different than desktop and web accessibility application development, right? So mobile app developers not thinking about accessibility a lot, not really well trained on it from the holistic sense of the market. But that's kind of the adoption curve that we also saw desktop developers and web developers go through as well. So we think that sort of sorts itself out on over a long period of time and continuum. In addition, we kind of touched on this before, assistive technologies really are fundamentally working in a different fashion on mobile platforms. And we see the evolution of assistive technology on mobile platforms taking a really different track than we see on desktop platforms. So on desktop platforms, and you can actually go back to the slide we were just talking about that had the adoption numbers for various different assistive technologies, most professional use on desktop platforms is with costed assistive technology. Most personal use is still with costed assistive technology, but some free and open source assistive technology and some bundled assistive technology with operating systems is coming into use. But really broadly what we see on desktop platforms is sort of aftermarket secondary software packages or secondary hardware packages that are installed. And then those hardware packages and software packages work with some degree of the underlying operating system components, but they also support some secondary scripting, things like JavaScript, Windows scripts, Dragon Naturally Speaking scripts, things like that, to sort of modify and change the way applications are interacting. So while we see that on desktop platforms with a lot of different platforms, on mobile platforms we've seen a really quick normalization to free bundled assistive technology that it comes as part of the core operating system. That on a mobile platform, the assistive technology you're going to use is the out-of-the-box operating system technology. That assistive technology is going to be installed on the phone out of the gate. All you're doing with the operating system is then configuring it and changing it. But also that assistive technology then has really, really strong operating system support that's woven into the fabric of the overall development environment ground up. And then ultimately then that means accessibility has to be supported directly through native application interfaces in apps or via proper coding, HTML, JavaScript, CSS in websites. And then hybrid apps are sort of a combination of those two. Hybrid apps I'll broadly define as applications that use embedded web content in them. Outside of that, another couple kind of cool things that we see floating around here with mobile devices. One is this concept of multi-device access solutions. And the concept here is if I take some sort of accessible application that I have on a phone and I combine it with an inaccessible piece of hardware, do I provide access to that at the end of the day? And you can think about this as concepts like, well, how do I get access to the display panel on my printer? How do I get access to the step count information that's on my Fitbit or fitness tracker? How do I get access to my cable set-top box that displays a certain channel and certain information? Or how do I get access to whatever is out there, any other physical piece of hardware? It could be my refrigerator, that's some sort of internet-enabled refrigerator, right? It could be my TV, etc. And so the historic thinking on this was, well, you have to incorporate multimodal access into the underlying hardware. So when you have a printer, the printer has to talk to you. It has to have tactily discernible keys. It has to have a mode of interaction or operation that works with a variety of different types of disabilities. The same thing would then be applied to a fitness tracker. Some people would argue that then you have a fundamental alteration, and so there's an exception for it, etc. But it was a really kludgy solution, and technically very difficult to implement on limited computing hardware and limited processing hardware that you have available to you in these embedded systems. With that said, a multi-device solution now makes that story much more compelling, easy to implement, cost-effective, and generally speaking, doable. So now if I take an accessible control application that sits on my accessible smartphone, I pair it with my inaccessible dumb piece of hardware like a computer, all of a sudden I have the ability to control and access all of the functionality of that piece of hardware in a easy, streamlined, simplified platform. Ditto for my fitness tracker, right? I can't necessarily put self-voicing functionality on my Fitbit, but I can control all of the aspects and get all of the information from my Fitbit from the accessible application that's packaged with it. Ditto for then all of these other hardware device solutions that we see. And we also see this as providing access at reasonable and logical points throughout the process. So I probably don't really want my Fitbit to be a voicing kit because it's not going to be able to speak loud enough. But I can have private access to it via a headset that connects to my headphone. That's probably a better solution as a whole from a usability perspective. And also functionally, it becomes a much easier thing to actually use. And the functional use cases for people with disabilities mirror kind of the general population functional use cases. So that's one thing we're really excited about. As a corollary to that, we also starting to see multi-device workflows and handoffs becoming more common. And this would be something like, hey, I want to start filling out a form on my mobile device. If it becomes too difficult to fill out there, I want to be able to transfer filling out of that form over to my desktop environment and be able to continue there. And so not just this idea that a multi-device access solution allows you to access dumb hardware, but also that you can do the workflow and take the active actions that you want on the right platform, the platform that's the simplest platform to use it on. And we see some cool stuff coming out of Apple on this. Real excited to see what actually happens on that from a handoff perspective, if this is something that sort of takes off in the market, people really like it, or if it's something that doesn't get widespread adoption. But we think this is kind of a cool idea. And also going back to the multi-device access solutions, provides access at logical points in the process and supports good functional use. The other really cool thing that we're interested in from a mobile perspective, and I gave you a shot of Amazon Echo here because I'm basically in love with this product, and not just am I in love with it, but my entire family is. It just shows you what you can really do with voice control systems. And so in addition to having this smartphone that's configured with assistive technology that's pretty compelling out of the box that works, we also now have speaker-independent voice control that's available to us pretty much on all of the mobile development platform. And we can have voice control and pretty reasonable audio interactions and audio interfaces for most applications that are out there. And kind of a common example and implementation of this you'll see is the voice-enabled personal assistants on mobile platforms, right? So pretty much all the dominant mobile platforms have one of these now. You get Siri on iOS, you get Google now on Android, you have Cortana on Microsoft. I have to give a shout out to Microsoft for naming their voice-enabled personal assistant Cortana, which is fantastic. Always like a good video game shout out there. And so we see these voice-enabled personal assistants really working. They have a ton of depth and a ton of features there now, and we expect that that happens going forward. So now if I add a voice-enabled personal assistant, all of a sudden I can control my phone through voice, I can control it through touch, I can get audio feedback, I can get visual feedback. We have a really compelling ecosystem that by just implementing the components of that ecosystem, we have fodder for a variety of multimodal access points. And what we see there ultimately is evolving to some redundant app interfaces in the best possible fashion. So if you want to use the visual interface and have assistive technology running on top of that, you can, and you can get an experience from that. If you want to just have an audio interface and just be able to talk to an application, you can do that as well and have an audio interaction with the application. And in the same vein, you can pick the device that works best for a workflow. You can pick the mode of interaction that works best for you. I won't spend too much time on the Internet of Things. This is really focused on this idea of continuing to take the concept of multi-device solutions and then roll it out further. And so essentially for the Internet of Things, right, we see this explosion of network-connected devices and network-connected components. And essentially from our perspective, our expectation is that, look, what you'll see with the Internet of Things is essentially this same concept of multi-device access solutions. And as we have more things that are out there and we have more things that we control through our mobile devices, we also have more gadgets that we just take with us and wander around the world with, we really see that you shouldn't expect access through the primary device, the primary piece of physical hardware. Likely scenario here is access through secondary application. Secondary application will connect with a smart device either via IP or via Bluetooth, and that ultimately that approach and that ecosystem will be much, much, much more compliant, much, much, much more accessible than another ecosystem. So outside of that, a couple other things to watch. One is responsive web design. We continue to see responsive web design as a big theme that's out there. Responsive web design we kind of easily define as a single unified design that works across multiple devices. Ideally, your responsive web design takes into account the needs of people with disabilities and accessibility needs across all of those different devices. And again, we would challenge you with the idea that a lot of times mobile device access can inherently be more accessible than desktop access. That is not in any way a rule, but sometimes that can be a good rule of thumb. And focusing on sort of the mobile device access as a primary means of interaction without limiting interaction in another use context can be a useful way to go. The other thing we see a lot that's out there that's really an issue to be aware of, and I'd probably tell you really to be careful about, is that frameworks, user interfaces, libraries are a really primary and dominant coding approach we see in general in web development, and we really see it extensively used in mobile web development. And essentially what that is, hey, look, it's going to be difficult for us to build all of the widgets, all of the controls that we want for the web platform in our responsive web design, so we're going to pull in a secondary library, be it jQuery UI, be it YUI, be it GWT, whatever that library and platform is. And our observation on this is that every framework has accessibility issues, and those accessibility issues tend to be unique to that framework. Support is definitely improving, but it's still limited. And the big thing to be aware of is that if you have an accessibility issue in the underlying framework or user interface library, they tend to be very, very difficult to fix. It's not that they're impossible to fix, but you often have to go in and really do some core surgery into the libraries to change the way that the user interface is being produced and how that user interface is working. And unfortunately, that can create a lot of instability in your standard visual user interface in terms of getting pixels moved around and items moved around and things with that. So our observation there is really just proceed with caution when you're looking at user interface libraries, and make sure that you are very actively evaluating accessibility as a core part of your selection of user interface library. And the picture that I have on this slide is a picture of Leo Tolstoy, and the quote I would give you on frameworks and UI libraries is like a quote that he has in Anna Karenina, which is, all happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And so you can kind of apply that to frameworks and UI libraries. All good accessible frameworks, UI libraries are alike, right? So if it's accessible, it works. But each one that's inaccessible is inaccessible in its own unique fashion. And unfortunately, pretty much all of them have accessibility issues at this point. Outside of that, one other thing to watch out there is really what do we end up doing from a standardization and use perspective for touch interfaces. One of the things that we see with mobile platforms is that keyboard access really just doesn't guarantee an accessible input method at this point. So ARIA, as an example, is kind of a good framework for thinking about this. We did a lot of work on ARIA in the community. There's a lot of great stuff that went into that specification that then has been published and is now really being adopted and embraced both by the development community as well as by the browser manufacturers and AT manufacturers. Lots of great ways to control stuff we couldn't control before on the web, but not a great paradigm to do a lot of those things if we don't have access to a keyboard. Not great use profiles and use patterns for how do we actually control visual interface items without a keyboard. And this is a big thing sort of across the board. Accessibility really just hasn't, as an industry, as a standard-making activity, grappled with this and figured it out. And so that's one thing to be aware of is how do we provide alternative access to things without a keyboard, but also then working as we go forward to really try to standardize that approach and those things. So as I mentioned, we'll bounce around a little bit to a couple different topics, try to keep it pretty fun and pretty light because I know everybody finds these topics fun and light, but really talk about different things. And the next thing to dig into is really agile accessibility, which first off has great alliteration because you can say alliteration, agile accessibility all in one go and keep it in A's. But also because we never talk to customers and say, hey, do you want agile accessibility? And they say, no, we want waterfall accessibility or unagile and slow accessibility. But really the idea here is we're not saying that mobile is inherently agile. It's just that mobile apps and sites tend to be newer. Mobile hasn't been around for that long. It's newer development. And most newer stuff tends to be developed in agile at this point. And there's all sorts of different agile methodologies that are out there. Almost every organization we work with has its own custom methodology, even though the methodologies say don't customize the methodology. That tends to be de rigueur. So every organization does this in a little bit different fashion. But by and large, it does end up getting what it's advertised to do, which is faster development cycles and quicker product into the marketplace. Most of the time we see Scrum being the dominant methodology in the marketplace. That's what we use here internally at SSB as well. And so most of the comments that we have here are focused on the Scrum methodology, but the stuff will travel pretty well to other Agile methodologies. But that said, we tend to be Scrummy. We tend to see Scrum in probably about 85 to 90% of customers at this point, and it seems to be what the industry has really normed around. So with that said, we really focus on three big things from an Agile accessibility perspective. The first thing is getting the definition of done correct, and the idea behind that is have the definition of done include WCAG 2.0 AA conformance. You can pick different accessibility standards. There are a lot of accessibility standards that are out there. There are some items in WCAG 2.0 AA that you may not be able to implement in native applications based on the way that the UI is implemented. You may have some challenges. But by and large, WCAG 2.0 AA is a pretty darn good standard for accessibility in general and applies pretty well to mobile applications. So one is updating that definition of done to include that. We also want to see that you have some sort of basic and appropriate accessibility testing that's associated with that, and that you actually also are collecting some records throughout that process. And so the idea is that your definition of done doesn't just say blindly, if you'll permit me that phrase, be WCAG 2.0 AA conformance. It says that you have to do that, and you have to demonstrate that you've actually done some testing around it, so that we have some records, so that we have some information about whether or not you have, in fact, validated this thing for compliance, and ideally that you've taken that record and uploaded it into whatever our configuration change management system is. That could be Jira, that could be Rally, that could be HPLM, it could be whatever you're using internally for that change control system. But the idea of the definition of done, including accessibility, is instead of just saying you need to make this thing accessible and it needs to WCAG compliant, there has to be some sort of task and some sort of activity associated with that, so we can show that the Scrum team or the Agile team has in fact validated the user interface component for accessibility. So that's item one, getting the definition of done updated and ensuring that that definition of done includes accessibility and includes it in a way that mandates or requires procedural validation of it. The second is this concept of personas. And essentially from a persona perspective, we would say include people with disabilities in the persona, but don't make them people with disabilities. And so what we mean by that is your persona should not be blind guy, right? That's a bad persona. Your persona could be system administrator using the system in assistive technology, system administrator using the system with a screen reader. So where we see bad personas are we name a disability type and then we write a case study around that. Where we see good personas is we name a manner in which people are using the system, and then we have those people using the system just happen to be using assistive technology. And then the final point, and we'll touch on this a little bit more as we get into this later on, is testing accessibility throughout the process, but also varying the level of accessibility that you test throughout the process. And so the lessons learned here is that if you go out and go full guns blazing and say every single user story that goes through our development process has to be validated against this 180-point accessibility checklist and all results have to be reported back, development will grind to a halt. You will not get any conformance to the process, and people will basically think you're crazy pants. Whereas what we like to do is let's evaluate some stuff for accessibility. Let's look at the data. Let's figure out the core accessibility issues that you really need to validate. Let's validate those at a couple points in the process. And then let's do iteratively more validation, more user testing at sort of secondary points in the process as the system comes together. So another core idea that we have here with Agile accessibility is really getting accessibility resources into the teams. And the core tenet here of accessibility as it applies to Agile is really just the application of the general Agile principle, which is a team needs to have all of the resources available to accomplish all of the planned items in a sprint. And so what that means is the team needs to be able to get all of the user stories to the definition of done by the end of the sprint. And they need tools, resources, whatever it is to be able to accomplish that. So that includes implementing the accessibility of features, so actually writing the code, getting the code implemented in a fashion that's accessible, testing for accessibility, so doing whatever level of user testing we want to have. And then we're slightly splitting hairs here and we're saying validating compliance requirements, which would be more of the normative testing for accessibility, going through and saying, does this conform to WCAG 2.0 AA requirements as an example. And so essentially what we look at in here is we say, okay, first thing you got to do is implement all of these features, right? Test for accessibility, et cetera. So how do we do that? And so basically people are like, okay, every single team should have an accessibility expert on it. But the problem that we get there is, right, well, that's expensive and doesn't scale. And then at some point, someone in the executive core of the organization realizes this is really going to be expensive and challenging. And so this is a bad situation, right? And they probably use an expletive or something to describe the situation, right? And so where we see this actually playing out in the real world, right, is kind of like that famous comic. And it's like the idea is that we have this really complicated equation that has accessibility testing, and then then a miracle occurs in the middle, right? And then the rest of the equation that solves, right? And so we've got to be a little more explicit in what we want to do there in that middle a miracle occurrence equation. So where we see most organizations evolving is that they use on-demand resources to support implementation. The sprint testing activities do not test for everything. The sprint testing activities only really focus on a small number of key accessibility items that we think in a cost-effective fashion we can train people on the team to test for. And then we do broader testing when we do system integration testing or release testing, that then includes people with disabilities using user acceptance testing. It may include some more formal testing and auditing of systems for compliance as well. And essentially what we see is this actually gives you pretty good accessibility, and it certainly gives you good enough accessibility. The idea with the sprint testing incorporating key accessibility items versus every items is we want to take that checklist of 180 items and drastically narrow it down. But we want to do that narrowing based on data that we have and be able to show the things that are on that checklist are statistically important, and be able to do that from the perspective of historic data, be able to do that from the perspective of the actual accessibility standards, and also be able to do that from the perspective of regression tests as we go in and fix things in the system, ensure that they're on the checklist. And so the core concept there is, so we have the sprint testing incorporating some key accessibility items. Those are the core things we think we can train quality assurance on the teams to test. Those are items we've shown to be statistically important, looking at the violation setup that we have in the application. And as just a really good rule of thumb, I'd tell you, you're probably going to get them to validate 10 conceptual things at most. And if you can train them to validate the top 10 things, you'll probably be able to get yourself to about 80 to 90% compliance. In sort of classic desktop environment, right, the top 10 things would be things like ensure that the images and visual items have alternative text, ensure that you can use the application effectively from the keyboard, ensure that the structure of the user interface is appropriate, that you have headings and those headings are structured properly, ensure that the form fields that you have proper labels, ensure that the form field components are grouped properly, and the list goes on from there. So while we may have 180, 200, whatever number of requirements under WCAG 2.0 AA, generally speaking, if we can limit it down to a short list, 10 things, give people really simple and explicit guidance on how to validate them, we actually can get pretty good conformance with those requirements. Andrea had a question online. She was asking who typically does the validation testing, a development team, member of SIT or UAT, or an accessibility specialist from the design team. And touching on that, I tell you, different people at different points. And so ideally, we see 3 tiers of accessibility testing throughout the process. One, which we haven't talked about here, is prior to user story definitions going into the team, to make sure that those user story definitions are actually validated for accessibility. And we'll talk about here when we talk about user stories in a second. But basically, that's during design. Make sure that you think about accessibility, and at that point we would recommend some expertise being engaged for user stories to make sure that you're specifying accessibility properly. During development, focus on the development and QA teams doing testing. Generally speaking, it falls to the QA teams to validate this, although we'd love to get developers to validate more, but that's sort of reality. Focus on QA validation on a short list of stuff we're confident we can train the QA team to validate. That short list then also gets augmented with automatic testing, which isn't a panacea, but does test a lot of things pretty quickly and pretty easily. And then the third category of testing is, as the application tends to come together, most organizations do separate sprints from releases, and they separate the concept of multiple different sprints going into a release and have a release process. If you are doing continuously released software, you won't have that, but the vast majority of enterprises we see do not do continuously released software for a variety of really good command and control reasons. And so essentially what we like to recommend is that as part of that more formal integration testing, user acceptance testing, whenever you start to roll out a bunch of features onto the market, that's the point at which you really want to dig in and make sure that you're doing broader testing specifically with people with disabilities to validate that the systems can in fact be used in assistive technology that is operated by an individual with disability that uses that assistive technology day in and day out. And then also as part of that, if you have some go-to-market requirements where you have to document accessibility, you can do it at that point as well. And Andrea had another question there about it, and if that is impossible testing by people with disabilities. You know, it really depends, and it's going to be specific to your situation. I would not shy away from the gold standard being including testing by people with disabilities. That is really ultimately the arbiter of access, if people that use assistive technology day in and day out can use it. With that said, the backup option there is normative testing and validating things against a testing checklist like WCAG. And any usability expert will tell you, right, you can do pretty good usability testing via some checklists and best practices, but ultimately you got to get users engaged to get it. And so that's kind of the same thing in accessibility. You can get pretty good results from following standards like WCAG, but ultimately sort of access is going to be user determined. And so there's nothing like the gold standard of getting people with disabilities to really validate it. With that said, on to user stories and kind of how user stories work. So user stories are your atomic, features or your atomic items that are going through, particularly a Scrum development process, but then most Agile development processes. And so the question is, how do we want to grow and evolve user stories to make sure that they account for accessibility? And the first thing we do is make sure that user stories that have some sort of user interface impact consider accessibility. That's a little bit of a mouthful, but basically that means when we're implementing something in the application, if it impacts the user experience, if it impacts the user interface, we need to think about accessibility as part of that. And as I mentioned earlier, we probably would recommend as you get started, that's a good point to engage accessibility expertise. And so as you build out that accessibility expertise and iteratively work with teams, this will be something that starts to be incorporated by product owners on an ongoing basis. But in the short term, you're going to have somebody that's looking at the wireframes, looking at the comps for a story, saying, okay, here you have an image, this image needs an alt attribute, here you have a form field, this needs a label. Unfortunately, we haven't had tons of success in training teams on how to do that out of the box or training product owners on how to do that out of the box. And so instead of trying to continue to do something that doesn't work, what we recommend is just doing some accessibility reviews with your internal experts and your product owners on upcoming features. You can make that part of your feature grooming and your user story grooming activities, and it shouldn't then impact the actual Scrum team development velocity, because by the time the user stories get into the teams, they've actually been planned. They've actually had accessibility built in. And then as a corollary to that, when you go in and do your planning and scoping of user stories in your sprint planning, make sure that we consider accessibility as part of that sprint planning. It sounds kind of intuitive, but the number of teams that don't do this would surprise you, or maybe not surprise you. And so just make sure when we're looking at how long does a user story take, we take into consideration the fact that we need to think about accessibility for this. And that's really nothing shocking. Most user stories, when they're getting scoped, they're also going to consider security impacts or privacy impacts. And so now we're just saying, hey, look, we need to think about the accessibility impact in development as well. And then finally on this component, really focus on consulting with central accessibility teams. We'll use the concept of an accessibility program office pretty much throughout the content that we use, and that's sort of what we think of as your central accessibility team. And so we would just encourage you at that time of definition, that's a really good time to have your product owners engage with you as a central team. Make sure you're thinking about accessibility during that fashion. And then on the other side of it, once the user story is defined, right, it goes into the Scrum team, it's perfectly implemented, everything comes out, there's a point at the end of the Agile process where somebody has to go in and say, yeah, this works, or yeah, it doesn't work. And ultimately, that's the acceptance process, which is, did we get the user story right? And what we would suggest is nothing too crazy, which is just, we'll have people with disabilities participate in the sprint reviews that you do. Are you going to do this for every user story? No, definitely not. You're not going to be able to get this for every single user story. It's generally not the case. If you can, I applaud you, and I'm looking forward to coming to your IAAP webinar at some point in the future. But you could probably do this on more than 0 stories. You can probably do it every couple of months. You could probably have a couple sprints where people with disabilities participate. And we find that this does really 2 things for organizations. The first thing it does is obviously mechanically it helps you accept the stories and make sure that accessibility is considered in the process. But the really compelling thing that this does is it provides a feedback loop with the development team, where the development team can then see real people with disabilities using the software and understand how the accessibility work that they're doing impacts real users. And it turns out that's way more powerful than the actual acceptance value that we get there, that people can really sort of put a face to the actual use of the application in assistive technology and understand that, hey, this has a real impact on people's lives. Finally, Andrea had another question. Are there good examples of how this should be documented in the wireframe and the user stories? We've been asked to put it as part of the acceptance criteria. There is not a standard way of doing it. The standard way, the closest that you would get to a standard fashion is actually putting it in the acceptance criteria. We would call that the definition of done, and that's what we were referring to earlier. The challenge with putting it into the acceptance criteria is that it has to then be validated, and that is where the rubber generally does not meet the road. So what I mean by that is the user story will say, this needs to be WCAG compliant, but no one will actually validate that the user story is in fact compliant. And so what we would recommend as the next turn of that dial is that you require records of that testing to be attached to the user story as it progresses across the Kanban board, basically as it progresses through the different hands that are touching it in development. And essentially the concept there is nothing more complicated than, hey, if you really are validating that this thing conforms to WCAG compliance, you should have done some tests. And if you've done some tests, you should have some records of doing those tests, and we would like to see those records to validate that, in fact, it does meet this acceptance criteria. And it's not perfect, but at least that gives you a structural way to add that in. And for those validation stuff, that's where you could use a system like AMP, which is sort of our software testing platform, and that's ultimately how a lot of that gets used in practical reality. Without getting too far into it, there's also, for more regulated industries, reasons you actually have to collect those records throughout the process. So it's good, just sort of disciplined development activity. But that's good stuff to reach out to a vendor like SSP on as well. Okay. So I was going to jump into some remediation options as well and talk about how do we actually go and fix this stuff in systems. And so there's a lot of cool stuff happening in remediation out there, and so basically it's just a flavor of different stuff that's floating around. A lot of people talking about overlays these days. I'm not overly wed to the overlay phrase, but people hear about it a lot. We have a solution in here called Alchemy. There are other solutions on the market that actually do this. But the concept of an overlay, not particularly complicated. Essentially, imagine in a web page, if you have a little chunk of JavaScript, you can also do this in native applications as well. The technology is not quite there yet, but we'll get there at some point in the immediate future. And essentially, you got this little chunk of profiling code, and on the web page, it's going to test the web page for accessibility. It has all of the limitations of automatic testing. There are some interesting things that we've done in Alchemy that can kind of expand the automatic testing, but basically, it's mostly going to find these automatic issues. It then calls it to the server, and it says, hey, I've got some stuff that's broken. Do you have some fixes for it? And then the server streams down a bunch of those fixes. It applies those fixes live to the page or the application and sort of patches the page live in the browser, or patches the application live in the operating system, and then you have an accessible experience in that component. What kind of is like positive and negative about this? The good is actually pretty good, and it turns out that this technology is a lot better than I think people give it credit for, and I am appropriately biased. Again, we have an application of this called Alchemy, so we build one of these, but we actually did a lot of research on these and looked at sort of what was working and what wasn't working, and came to the conclusion that actually the good does outweigh the bad, but it's only in specific cases. So the good thing here is we get a live detection of the state of the application. So that could be an app, that can be a website, whatever it is, mobile site. Kind of the prior state of the art was either in development testing, where all we did was test source code of the application, in QA testing, where we tested things in QA, but we really didn't have an understanding of what it looked like when it was deployed. And so overlays give us the ability to do that. We can actually see what the application looks like on deployment out in the wild vis-a-vis use. Obviously, the other thing we can do is start fixing things live. So if we have an issue, we don't have to go back and make a source code change, propagate that source code change through a development process, and then push it out via patch to the live site, right? We can quickly patch simple things in a simple fashion, right? So if we have an image that doesn't have alternative text, we can quickly provide that alternative text up on the site. We don't have to change the underlying source code to do it. Once we have sort of the JavaScript or source code library in there, it's baked in, so the code isn't static. We don't actually have to go and change the source code to fix things. We can also apply things really quickly across a very, very wide scale. So once we detect the first image that's missing alternative text on the site, or the first image in the application that's missing alternative text, we can then fix it for every single other instance of that automatically. So instead of having to go and modify 100 pages of source code by making one change and then applying it automatically, we basically fix the issue everywhere that it occurs. And then if we detect that issue again, we can then automatically fix it. So the bottom line of the good is it's really, really fast because it doesn't take a lot to deploy. It fixes things in real time. And it's also really, really cheap relative to actually going and fixing the source code and changing things and re-QAing it and doing all of that. So overlays really good for the stuff that they work on. The problem is they don't really work on that broad of a set of issues. And what I would tell you is they tend to work well for what we would call point fixes, which are changes to specific visual interface elements on the page, specific discrete components. They don't work well for complicated usability issues. And so an example of a point fix would be take this image and update the alternative text to this, or take this form field and update the ARIA label for it or the associated label for it to this. Those are good point fixes. They're easy to change. They're discrete. They're at a very, very specific point in the document object model. If you're using a compiled application in the actual source code of the application, basically you can set those properties live. So that works well. When you start to talk about multi-screen workflows, multi-page workflows, usability issues where the structure of a page isn't correct, where we need to restructure a form so that the form fields flow in a different fashion, where we have to change the tab order of the page, that's where overlays really start to fall apart, and they don't work so well. The other issue there is that a lot of the first order issues are things we can address with point fixes, but a lot of the second order issues, which are the things people tend to get in trouble for, really have to be fixed in a more substantive fashion. The other bad thing is, right, you do have to add a JavaScript dependency in your page. So you're adding more JavaScript. JavaScript has to work on the page for that to happen. The fixes are, as I mentioned, relatively constrained in terms of what they can fix. And then the triggering conditions are also automated. So you can't really have really complicated triggering logic. The triggering logic has to be pretty straightforward for it to work at speed. It has to basically be like, when I see this alt attribute, replace it with this alt attribute, and then that has to work in a scalable fashion. So that's kind of the bad. Then the ugly stuff here, which is the really scary stuff, one is security. So fundamentally, you're streaming fixes to your site from a third-party SaaS provider. And so we at SSB, third-party SaaS provider, tons and tons of security, lots of restrictions in terms of how that data is uploaded to the server, is what we do with the data, how we send it back out. But at the end of the day, there is a third party involved, and that can be some pretty significant concerns. You also are modifying pages live that haven't gone through development process that appropriately creates a lot of concerns. There's also not great support for assistive technology. A lot of these fixes to really work require ARIA, and ARIA simply doesn't work across all assistive technologies. Dragon Naturally Speaking in particular has really limited, if no support. And we're also not sure exactly what this will mean from a legal perspective. And the reason for that is a lot of the legal cases we see these days are being driven based on automated source code scanning. And what I mean by source code scanning there is really HTML, JavaScript, CSS coming back from a server, or sort of application profiling happening manually. And those source code scans may or may not actually take into account what's actually happening in the overlay level. So with that said, our take on overlays, they're great for a subset of the problem. They fix a slice of the accessibility problem very well. They do it at a great, great price point, and the technology works. But it is not a panacea. It does not make the site accessible. It basically is a tool that you can help to deploy. And as long as you deploy it in that context, it works pretty well. With that said, right, well, what's the classic approach? Well, the classic approach is I actually just go in and make the relevant source code changes to the site, and I actually figure out what's wrong with it, and go in, and I change this alt attribute to be this, and I change this form field element to have the right label, directly fix the site, right? In this case, it's great because there's zero ambiguity about the fixed state of the site, right? You are getting final accessibility solutions from the server. And so that's the good part, right? You can also fix these complicated multi-workflow issues, things that span multiple different screens. You can control those fixes that you're pushing in an amazingly tight fashion, especially for apps that are native apps on operating systems. You can really, really constrain and concisely control the exact accessibility experience. It's all coming from your server, so there's no secondary server JavaScript needed. You know the support level in AT because we validated it in our underlying operating system testing when we went through, our agile development process, as we just mentioned. It's also legally defensible because it's all of what you're showing to the end user from a code perspective is there and available. So it gives you kind of the best defensibility there. What's the bad? Well, I can't monitor for live changes. So if I have user-mediated content, user-contributed content, if I have multiple people contributing things to my site, multiple people contributing content that goes into my app, I can't actually monitor that stuff that's live, and a lot of that stuff happens independent of a development lifecycle process. Even if there's a publishing process, it tends to be a lot more lax than an actual formal development. Also, I have to go in and fix every single individual component individually. So if I have the same image repeated 1,000 points in my source code, I have to go fix it at 1,000 points in my source code. But the ugly stuff here is really why people don't use this for everything, which is really slow because you got to go through a full development process for every point change that you have and you want to make. And it's expensive because I have to use developer time to go in and remediate and fix code in the application. So then the question is always, okay, great, Springer, I get it. What do people actually do? And the answer is, in the real world, people tend to do a little bit of both. And so a lot of what we'll see is people deploy overlays to do immediate discovery of issues, start actively patching issues that are in the application that are present, that they want to fix quickly without all the muss and fuss of going through source code revisions. And then over the long term, slowly start to propagate those fixes back into the code base, continuing to monitor the application and then use the overlays to deliver hot patches or hot fixes. And that kind of gives you the best of the both worlds. It lets you quickly fix the stuff that's wrong with a site at a low price point. And by controlling the timing that you use to make the longer term changes into the code base, you get to make those changes at a time where it's most cost advantageous to your organization. Going back and retrofitting things tends to be very expensive for accessibility. If we start to design accessibility into the process and we build it into new screens that we're building and we update screens as we go, it tends to be a lot cheaper to do it. And sometimes those cost factors can be like order of magnitude differences, 1 to 10 differences. And so that's really where we see most people actually remediating things in the real world, is kind of taking the best of the patching and the overlay systems, the best of the underlying source code changes, and using them together. And this is a Zen-like picture of a young Buddhist monk, and that is the feeling that you will get if you were to adopt this strategy in the real world. So with that said, talk about testing options, and then do a quick summary and open it up for questions. So lots of different options for testing things for accessibility. And essentially we see sort of 5 options. None of these are mutually exclusive, and in practice we see a lot of these used in terms of overlapping fashion. And going back to kind of my earlier comments on Agile, it's about using the right approach at the right point in the process, and then sort of overlaying the different approaches so that we get some redundant test coverage in the best possible sense of redundancy. Basically, we see static code analysis, And that's essentially look at my HTML, JavaScript, CSS, Objective-C, whatever the source code is, or the source code that's being ultimately rendered, if it's sort of interpreted source code. Take a look at that and run a bunch of tests on it. And these are kind of classic automatic testing solutions that are out there and available. The second is this idea of sort of application profiling. And this is something we do with a product called AMP for Mobile. On the SSB side, there's some other solutions out there. But basically the idea is you compile in a library into your application. Then as you're doing your basic QA testing of the application, we also will capture screens in the background, test them for accessibility, and provide you that report in terms of where it's at. And so what's nice about the profiling thing is it basically lets you test accessibility just by using an application. You don't have to do anything else, and also test the live application. The third thing we see is OS testing tools, different testing tools on particularly iOS and Android that I'll talk about. These are actually, I think, underused and very, very compelling tools, and they let you really concisely diagnose accessibility issues, and there's actually pretty solid tools that are out there. So we'll touch on those. And the last two are kind of the classic approaches to accessibility, which is manual testing, validating it against a manual checklist. You're not going to be able to get around this, so you might as well just understand where you want to do it and how you want to do it in the process. And then finally, actual user testing, right? Have people with disabilities actually go in and test the application. So with that said, right, starting off with static code analysis. So the basic idea here is pretty straightforward, right? I give you source code, you run some automatic tests on it, and then you tell me what's wrong with it. It's great for what it does, right? It's quick, it's cheap. I would actually tell you source code analysis is essentially free, right? If you pay for a license for software to do it, or you use whatever it is, right, once you've paid for that, any incremental tests are free, right? You press a button, you get a report back. It also is great because it lets you deal with issues right during development, so we don't have to wait until a later point in the development process to go back in and fix stuff, right? We can get to it then when it's the absolute cheapest time to fix things. The bad is it doesn't really work very well. And sort of the analogy I would give you is this is kind of like a 1980s era spell check, right? It can kind of look things up in the dictionary, and it can be like, this is a dictionary word, this isn't a dictionary word. But to actually get a good spell checker, it turns out you have to be able to detect patterns and acronyms and phrasing things and modifications of words and hyphenated words and all this stuff. And so that's kind of where you're at with most static source code analysis, particularly on mobile platforms. Like, it's good, but it's going to come back with a lot of false positives that you got to scan out, and you still have to use your judgment. The ugly stuff here is that it's only really going to cover about 20 to 25% of the requirements. But your boss is going to assume that it covers 80 to 100% of the requirements. And what that really means is that there's a huge danger with any automatic testing, but particularly static code analysis, to assume that it tests for a lot more than it really does test for. And so the key thing that we would tell you is it'll test for a lot of base stuff, but most of the time the things that we see organizations getting in trouble for are not the things that are actually tested for by static code analysis. For example, static code analysis can tell you, does an image have or does it not have an alternative text, has it set an accessible name. It can't actually tell you if that's meaningful, and a lot of times the meaningfulness issues are the ones that really drive the day. Also, it doesn't actually test the final on-device experience. You're still testing static code. There may be other things that change the source code on its route to being rendered in the application that actually impact that. And so you still test like sort of an abstraction of the on-device experience. The second testing approach that we see is application profiling. And this is, full disclosure, the way that we do it with AMP for Mobile. So this is an approach that we use in this AMP for Mobile product, which is a product we developed with IBM. The idea here is pretty straightforward. You take your application, you add in a library when you're doing development, just whenever you're building development builds of it, not when your final release builds. And essentially, that library then just does profiling of the application as you browse through the application as you're using it. And so it happens as part of your standard QA process. It's also quick and really cheap. Also lets you catch issues during development. It goes one step further than static code analysis, which is kind of nice in that it tests the on-device experience. So it actually tells you, here's how this rendered in simulator. If you actually do a development build onto a device, it'll actually tell you exactly how it works on the device. So that stuff's pretty great. Challenges, you got to set it up, and setting it up is kind of a pain. You have a library, so you got to build that library into your application as part of the use factor, so they're set up there. The ugly is that while it now covers more of the components that you're going to see, say it covers about 40% of the requirements, you still will have people thinking it covers 90 to 100% of the requirements. And so we still need to make sure that, hey, look, while we've covered more in sort of the profiling scenario, it's still not covering everything. It's still covering a small subset of the requirements, and while that subset of the requirements has increased, there's still a lot of stuff that we need to do, and we need to be really careful about managing expectations so people understand, hey, look, there's still stuff that we have to test here. Another final approach that we see sort of purely on the development side of the house is inspection tools testing. And the idea here is testing on the device or in a simulator with an inspector tool. Good examples of this, Accessibility Scanner on Android 6, Accessibility Inspector on iOS Simulator, both great tools to use during the development process. So I recommend you check those out. The good here, right, so you can actually see on screen how various different items are configured. Accessibility Inspector on iOS does a really cool job of this, where it'll actually show you in the simulator what the accessibility information is for various different components. You can then take that, address those issues during development. You don't have to do them at a secondary point. You can test the actual on-device experience, right? All sorts of good stuff like that. So it works pretty well for that. The challenge here is you need source code access to run it, at least on the iOS. One of the cool things with Accessibility Scanner on Android is you don't need source code access to run it. You can actually run it as an application in Android, which is really cool. And we think that's actually one of the really great things that's happened in Android, because it's a much easier way to test. The other thing is that you also just have to know sort of what you're testing. One of the nice things about the static code analysis and one of the nice things about the application profiling is they don't really require a lot of domain knowledge to actually test. The inspection tools, Accessibility Inspector more so than Scanner, require you to actually know what are you trying to do in the APIs, what data should you be exporting, and then making sure that those data works. And the ugly is now it starts to get expensive. Like now we've actually got to go through and do testing of the application. The automation starts to go out of it. And so it's not as cheap and not as easy as some of the automated tools. And then the next approach we see is full-on manual testing. And this is tests on a device that has assistive technology, that's keyboard, switch, manual inspection, whatever your testing approach is. You do manual testing. Most people are doing this against a checklist of requirements. Again, most of the time that tends to be based on WCAG 2.0A or AA. SSB is an example, and AMP carries an 80 item checklist for iOS WCAG conformance, but a 65 item checklist for Android WCAG conformance. So essentially you have one of those checklists, you go through, you're validating all of the different screens against those checklist requirements, and then reporting back the issues. So the good, really clear conformance testing, right? You know exactly what you're testing for WCAG. You have a clear understanding of the issues. You can do that testing in parallel with QA if you want. So if you invest the resources to do that, you then get that feedback in the development process. But the bad is now we actually have to take the time during the sprint cycles to carve out some real testing to do this. I have to know what I'm testing, so I've got to have some domain knowledge to do this. And it's now become like materially expensive. So right, we've gone fully from the automatic end of the spectrum to the manual end of the spectrum, and now I'm inspecting each individual component. So I actually really have to go through, test every screen, test every component, and it gets real expensive. And so then the final one we see is then sort of a secondary iteration of the manual testing, but this is really then user acceptance testing. And while not all users with assistive technology are going to, or sorry, not all users with disabilities are using assistive technology, you may also get some other different features that are out there in some different modalities. A lot of times we'll see this, you know, people with disabilities using assistive technology to do testing. But that's the basic idea. I have users come in and I do testing. Ultimately, this is it. You know, we would tell you that this is the best test of how the apps are going to fare in the real world. It's really directly addressing the key legal risk factors, the go-to-market factors that you have. But the bad is it takes time. You have to have the actual users engaged in the process. And ultimately, it tends to happen in the process well after development. If it's happening as part of your release process, if it's happening as part of your release cycle, you're past the point at which you can actually change things in the development process. And so now fixing these issues is also more expensive in addition to testing it. So then the real question is like, all right, well, great, what do we do? And the answer is most people kind of mix it up. During development, we recommend you use some sort of mix of static code analysis and application profiling. You can use one or the other or both. They work together, but do some of that. Provide some training for very basic inspection tools testing to the developers, potentially to your quality assurance team as well, and do just the quick, cheap tests that we know we can do in development. During quality assurance, take the approach that we talked about in Agile, adopt it here, and essentially test a specific set of the requirements using manual testing. But let's not try to test all 80 of the iOS WCAG requirements. Let's try to test the top 10. Let's try to test the top 15 at most. So really narrow that down, get it to be a limited set of testing. And then let's do user acceptance testing, but let's do that testing at release time when we're doing broader development cycles and kind of then integrate that into the process. One final note on testing really comes down to monitoring. And the biggest thing I could tell you is that please collect the data that you have from the testing process in a central location. Ideally, that will combine your automatic testing, your manual testing, and user testing. This is a business problem that AMP, as an example, which is our product, is designed to solve, which is collecting all of that data in one place, getting it into a consistent format that can then be analyzed. Basically, what that lets you do is start to understand where are we at in terms of compliance, where do we need to invest in terms of accessibility, what things are issues, what things really aren't issues, how can we build, modify, change our development processes on an ongoing basis so we get just the right level of testing and development effort in the teams, but we're not making them test for 80, 110 items for accessibility, a variety of which aren't relevant. And all that stuff comes out of an analysis of the data. And we like to look at two really big slices. One is product level slices. So look at a product or project over time and see how the compliance level varies. And then the other slice that's great is individual Scrum teams. And what you'll find is some Scrum teams will do features and components better than other Scrum teams and be able to look at those and understand, okay, this population of users or this product as a whole has higher accessibility. What are they doing right? This one over here has lower accessibility. What are they not doing right? And then how can we help normalize that across the organization? That then feeds back into your policies and training activity. So updating your policies, updating your approach, and then updating your training so that it then reinforces and addresses those lessons learned. And my favorite quote on that is from W. Edwards Deming, who is sort of a godfather of industrial process in the United States. And the quote is, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." So a couple final summary points, and then we'll just open it up for questions if you have any questions. So high level, going back to the beginning, right? Mobile use is exploding, right? We went from 1% to 73% of the global population in the last 15 years using mobile devices. In addition, where we're spending our time is changing, and we're spending more and more time on mobile devices than we are on desktop devices, specifically for digital media. Ultimately, we see it for sort of all screen time access in the fullness of time. We're already doing more for digital media. We expect that that will continue to grow over time. While we're not there yet, we do see mobile use reaching parity with desktop use for people with disabilities. So is mobile only a reality? No, it doesn't really work from an accessibility perspective quite yet, but it's getting close. And we see the penetration, particularly of smart devices, being quite high, and that those smart devices have really robust functional uses. In addition, we would argue that the platforms probably are inherently a little more accessible, but also that the regulatory factors start to drive that. So we think from a form factor perspective, there's a big strong case to be made for that, but also from the sort of market factors perspective, there's a big case to be made for, if I want to make something accessible, that a mobile platform is probably actually a really good platform to natively build it on. And finally, we see these multi-device accessibility solutions really driving things forward. So, everybody says the Internet of Things is going to grow and explode. More and more stuff's going to be happening out there. And so we see these sort of multi-device environment is really driving that and making that possible out there. From an Agile accessibility perspective, right, update the definition of done to include accessibility. As mentioned before, you may also see acceptance criteria being a term that's used there. As you do accessibility, understand and take the pain of embedding or provisioning accessibility testing resources and development resources with the team. You can't get around that, and so you got to just address it heads on and make sure that that's happening. And really focus on getting a good split out of what do we want to validate during the sprint versus what do we want to validate during the integration and user acceptance testing. And rule of thumb I would give you there is, again, there's probably about 10 things you're going to be able to train your teams on to actually validate accessibility. So 10 things. You could also throw like the 80-20 rule at it in terms of a power law distribution, right? A small number of the issues in the application, a small number of sort of the classes of issues are going to count for the dominant set of issues in the application. And all of those things are things that we want to focus on from an Agile accessibility perspective. As I mentioned, from a data monitoring perspective, having the data to understand, well, what are the core things that we have to address in accessibility, and constantly updating, expanding, and then retraining the teams around that. And then finally, from a remediation and testing options perspective, lots of options for remediation, right? You can do overlays, you can do direct code changes, different places in the development process, different levels of value for that. Ultimately, we recommend doing a little bit of both. Your use then changes over time and grows and evolves, but they both have their place and they both work pretty well for what they do, so just don't overly rely on one or the other, and you'll probably get the best of both. Ditto kind of for testing option. Lots of options, benefits and detriments to each of them. Not really materially different than the choices that you have to make in desktop environments either. Development processes tend to be the same. So really figure out the mix that works for your organization. Make sure that it does use automatic testing, static code analysis, or application profiling. Both are really good. Give your developers some training on doing some of the inspection tools. But don't forget to include user testing and more formal validation as part of the process. You really can't get around it at this point. So that's it for the formal stuff. We'll pretty much open it up to questions. There's a couple questions that came in the chat window, so I'll just go ahead and read those out. And then if you have more questions, shoot them in the chat, and we can talk about them. Eliana was asking, do you have a sense of how many current apps could be considered accessible? I had a blind, visually impaired friend tell me that about 95% of all apps are not accessible. He didn't have a data source to confirm. What do you think? I don't know. I would guess that it's 95% or higher of all apps are not accessible. Obviously, it would depend on your definition of accessible. If we used materially WCAG 2.0 AA conformant, yeah, my guess would be that the number of accessible apps is on the order of 1 to 3%, and the number of inaccessible apps is drastically higher than that. And that's sort of my view of, we kind of talked about this back at the beginning. Let me see if I can pull up the slide that I was looking at here. But essentially that, the app developer understanding and actual application support is still really low, but it is gaining. And so I think that has less to do with the platform issues on mobile applications and more to just do with developers aren't thinking about it, and candidly the business pressures haven't been there to make things accessible. So while we think the platform probably supports sort of accessibility better at an inherent level, the application developers just don't think of it or do it at this point. And for that to ultimately change, the market dynamics will have to really drive that, right? There's got to be a good business reason to do it. John had a question, has SSB encountered any testing related to wearables? If so, what are the greatest challenges? We have done some testing related to wearables here. We also are strong adopters of wearables, actually in this office, with a lot of people with disabilities. Really the issue with wearables that we see goes back to this concept of sort of multi-device access solutions and this equation of accessible app plus inaccessible hardware equals access, but has a question mark, right? So a wearable that is totally inaccessible from any sort of general definition of accessibility, but imagine if it's just a dumb wearable piece of hardware. If it is in fact paired with an accessible app, generally speaking, we think that that makes it accessible at the end of the day. With that said, the challenges there are actually the challenges of making pretty much any app accessible, and goes back to, I think, Ileana's question, which is, well, theoretically this is possible, but practically speaking, you actually have to make the app accessible, and that's basically where we see the challenges. So it's not that the hardware tends to need to be redesigned and modified. The hardware tends to be fine and support accessibility from an overall, the potential for accessibility. I don't think we've really ever seen anything that couldn't be made accessible from a hardware perspective, but the issue then becomes, is the app itself actually accessible? And that tends to be where things basically fall off. We'll keep it open for questions for just about one more minute. And if there are any questions, I'll hand things back to Natalie. All right, I think that's about it. Natalie, do you want to wrap things up at the end, or should we just close things out? Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim, again, for being here today as our speaker. Excellent job. I'd also like to thank TCS Interpreting for providing our closed captioning. Just a few wrap-up items. Please feel free to take our webinar feedback survey, provide any comments. We're kind of also looking to receive any testimonials, anything that you could provide as good feedback for us going forward. Also, just a reminder that our live webinar packages are now available if you would like to purchase the rest of the live attendance for the rest of the year. We also have a few upcoming webinars in May, June, and July. Our full schedule is still located on our website, and our archives are on sale. So with that, I think we will conclude. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Please exit out by just closing out of your window. Thanks so much again, Tim.